My name is Charles Snow, and I'm the chairman of the organizational design community. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, which kicks off a year-long campaign called Organizing for Good. ODC was established 10 years ago as a collaborative community of scholars and business professionals who are dedicated to advancing the theory and practice of organization design. At the time, the field of organization design had no single organization that was trying to bridge the gap between theory and practice. That is, to create research studies and findings that organizational designers could use to improve how they organized and managed people and other resources. Today, ODC owns the highly regarded Journal of Organization Design, offers both a webinar and podcast series, holds an annual conference that appeals to both researchers and practitioners, and has a commercial company that accredits course providers in the area of organization design. Along with its partners, ODF and EODF, the Organization Design Forum and the European Organization Design Forum, ODC jointly operates a program that certifies organization design professionals. Lastly, ODC recently signed an agreement with Accenture to become a corporate sponsor. Accenture has set an objective to have the world's best organization design practice, so it is very exciting for ODC to be part of this developmental process. To mark its 10th anniversary, ODC is pleased and honored to be joining with the United Nations Refugee Agency in a year-long campaign called Organizing for Good. Joel Nielsen of the UN will introduce this campaign shortly. Let me simply say that ODC, from its humble beginnings 10 years ago, is now in a strong position to make a difference in the world of organizations. And this is an immensely satisfying possibility that we are very much looking forward to. Thank you, and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Charles. Over to you, Joel.
So thank you very much for this, Charles, and a very warm good morning, good afternoon to all of you on the webinar. So my name is Joel Nielsen, and I am representing UNHCR in this partnership with ODC around the campaign for Organizing for Good. So I'll just take a few minutes to provide a little bit of context in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, and then even less time in terms of providing a reason for why I think it's so exciting to be part of this partnership with the broader ODC community. But let me just turn to the Sustainable Development Goals initially, if I can shift my screen. Yes, there we are. So I'm aware that not everybody are equally familiar with the SDGs, so just a little bit of background. So the Sustainable Development Goals, and there are 17 of them, were formulated by governments in 2015. And as it says on the screen, they provide a blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. And for me, the key word is, of course, better, but also sustainable. And the sustainability concept really is all about meeting the needs of today without jeopardizing the needs of future generations. So that's what it's really all about. The primary role of UN in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals is actually to support governments implementing the universal Sustainable Development Goals and the priorities that flow from that. I think it's important that we support governments in implementing, and it's important that we also acknowledge that the SDGs are universal. So they are for all countries across the globe and for everyone. So they are not just targeting the North or the South, but for all of us. And we tend to work at two levels as UN and provide the support, and that is at country level, and that's probably where we are most visible. And then, of course, we have all the high-level processes, policy processes, intergovernmental processes, and also advocacy as part of what we do and how we engage. For those of you who joined us a little bit early, you also heard us talking about the founding, or one of the basic principles of the SDGs, the principle of leaving no one behind, and the principle of reaching those who are furthest first, which is really a commitment to fight poverty, end discrimination, reduce discrimination, but also in particular to reduce vulnerabilities. And it's very much a hook into the SDGs for organizations, UN organizations such as UNHCR, where I'm working. The Global Compact for Refugees, which was adopted by member state governments in 2018, and I do apologize for all the acronyms, but the Global Compact for Refugees is really an example of how UN organizations, and in this particular example, UNHCR, have also been forced to think differently and effectively also organize differently. And the Global Compact for Refugees is a way of linking forced displacement, so addressing the issues around people who are forced to flee for different reasons, with the Sustainable Development Goals, and it provides that entry point for us to support those who are the most vulnerable, those who are the furthest behind first. So that's very much how we work with the SDGs as a UN agency. And of course, there is lots of data out there and lots of writing around the SDGs if you're interested in more about the SDGs. So this last slide is really, I think, you have the 17 SDGs on the right-hand side, and then you have a quote which has been attributed to Einstein, but I'm not really sure whether that is true or not. But I think nevertheless that it has a really good point. So we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking that we used when we created them. And I think for me that's really at the very core of why this partnership is so important, and also what I hope that we in UNHCR and the broader UN community and everybody who is on this call and will be part of the campaign is taking away. I mean, basically the idea that we need to think differently about how we organize to actually address the interdependency and the interdependencies of these complex issues that we have to address, that are encaptured in the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that's why the organizing is so interesting for us as the UN. So in terms of wrapping up, let me just thank Mariam Kaka from UNHCR, who actually made this possible, Panish and Burrow, who are the ones that I've talked to most from ODC, but the entire ODC community. Thank you everyone for reaching out. And then also I wanted to thank and maybe also highlight the two discussants of today. So one is Mats Svensson, a fellow colleague from the UN, who has been engaged in change management across a number of different UN entities in the past 15 years. So I'm very happy to have you on the call, Mats. And Jens Flanding, a colleague from UNHCR, who also have had a career in in several UN organizations and working with change, and in particular working with change from the perspective of technology and how technology can drive culture change. So different perspectives, and I look very much forward to also your comments on the two presenters. But this is it, and thank you very much to the entire organizational development community for reaching out and for making this possible. So back to you, Panish.
Thank you, Joel. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all to this opening session of the Organizing for Good campaign. Our thinking behind this campaign was largely around what can be an inspirational mission for the ODC on the occasion of its 10th anniversary. And we thought, why not think about organization design as a force for good? That the knowledge and the research and the skills we put together in this domain, how can we bring it to bear to solve some of the world's most important problems? We've managed to assemble an absolutely stellar cast of academics who are leading tracks, and these tracks map in many-to-one or one-to-one ways to these 17 SDGs. And over the course of the next 1 year, at the intervals of about a month and a half, we will have webinars, online discussions, social media activity, all geared around bringing together ideas from organization design and to the world of sustainability. Now, we certainly don't want to pretend that till the launch of this campaign, there was no research in management on sustainability issues. It's far from true. However, we do want to use this particular campaign as an opportunity to curate, to highlight, and also to some extent stimulate new research in these domains. So if one can think about long-term objectives of this exercise, an important one is to introduce and welcome in the next generation of researchers, particularly doctoral students, to come into this domain thinking about how can they use their skills as organizational design researchers to tackle some of these extremely important problems that we all confront today. With that background, let me also share with you a link here which gives you the web page for ODC. And you can see there the other track chairs who very kindly agreed to lead various different discussions connected to the SDGs over the course of the next 1 year. And of course, we're particularly honored and delighted to begin this series with Professor Andy Van De Ven. He's one of the stalwarts in the area of organization design, one of the most highly cited, most influential scholars in the field. And he and his colleague, Marshall Scott Poole, whom we are hoping will join us shortly, are going to be talking about their multi-year project on organizational change, which culminated in the publication of a handbook. And this handbook is really a completely masterly compilation, because if you look through the index of who's contributed, who's who in the field of organizational design is in there, and more broadly management. And what Andy's promised to do for us in this webinar is to give us the main highlights, and in particular link some of the most interesting ideas from that work to the problem of organizational change in the service of sustainability. With that, Andy, let me turn it over to you, and you have about 40 minutes between you and Scott, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Panish. It is indeed a wonderful honor to be here and to have this opportunity to share with you our findings on some of the lessons we've learned. First of all, let me ask, Scott, are you available? Are you able to be on our webinar? So there must be some technical difficulty there. And, I tried to reach him, yeah. And do you see my screen? Is this proper for everyone to see?
It would be good if you go into presentation mode, Andy. Yeah, perfect.
All right, here we go. Well, thank you. The objective, the task before us is awesome. To begin to discuss how might we start thinking about designing change, an organizational change in for the good of addressing the 17 SDGs of the United Nations. Scott and I, thanks to Joel, provided a nice introduction to these 17 SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals. And when we start thinking about these massive kinds of challenges, it led us to reflect upon what have we learned from editing this Oxford Handbook of Organization Change. This Oxford Handbook is itself a mega project. It involved 31 chapters and 5 essays by about 60 authors and co-authors from 47 different universities in 20 different countries, with 35% being female and 65% male. So we have a highly diverse set of scholars from around the world who were and have written about the latest reflections of what has occurred with regard to understanding organizational change during the past 20 years or so. As you can see, we have many chapters that are organized around planned change, dialectical change, life cycle or regulated change, evolutionary change, hybrid process models, and core aspects of these change processes. And they boil down to, and the organizing framework were these 4 basic perspectives or process models of thinking about organization change. Plan change basically consists of beginning with a dissatisfaction that leads people to search and screen for a better solution, to set an environment and envision goals and implement them. Conflict change or dialectics is when an existing status quo thesis is opposed by antithesis that leads to conflict and confrontation to produce a synthesis that is oftentimes neither the thesis nor synthesis. Evolutionary change is a process of variation, selection, and retention. It is competition for scarce resources that are available. And then life cycle tends to be the regulated change, either internal within the system or by some external agent who directs and mandates a change process. Some of our authors met together in Boston in August 14th, and Scott and I then listened to everyone's drafts of their presentations that we just presented here. In the course of doing so, we came up with, and as we reflected upon this experience, we learned a great deal from these different efforts to edit this process. And as you can see, we have distilled 7 insights. Of course, there's many more that emerged, but it's 7 that struck us as particularly relevant for thinking about the SDGs, the UN. And these insights begin first at kind of at the micro level, focusing on how do we think about change, and is there evidence from science about the models we use for change, and a very frequent use and concern about resistance to change. And then we begin to look more at the global changes that are occurring, as well as the more macro issues of bottom-up dialectical change, managing complex system change, running in ecosystems, and finally ending up with power and with leadership. But there is one overall insight that strikes me that we should be thinking about, that organization design, ODC community, as Chuck said, really started off with thoughts of arranging the structure, the strategy, the culture, and related things of an organization. And in many ways, what we're doing today is trying to think of this as designing processes or flows of change for producing some virtuous cycles and to avoid some vicious cycles that often unfold as change processes unfold. So for the remainder of this overview, and feel free to raise questions as we go along, but I must say I don't have access to the chat line. So maybe Fanish, if there is any issues that need my interruption, please do so.
Will do.
So let's begin with, what model of change do you use? As we mentioned, there are many different models of change and lots of variations of these models of change. But in the main, we mentioned 4 models. Plan change. When people are in agreement, we can talk about plan change. Life cycle change, when they are mandated or regulated. dialectics, when people or the parties involved are in conflict, and evolution, when competition for scarce resources is present. So the key insightful question, I think, is when change does not unfold as we expect, and if we are the change agent, what do we do? Do we change the organization and the people to fit the model in our head? Or do we change the model in our head to fit the flow of what's going on in the organization? By and large, my experience is that most managers and change agents focus on trying to change the organization time and again to fit their particular model of change, typically planned change, as opposed to going with the flow and changing the model in their head. That implies that we understand a wide number of a repertoire of alternative models in our head for engaging in processes of change. The second insight is, well, we just listened, is there evidence, scientific evidence, for these popular planned change models? And as you can see, item 6, Michael Beer, who's here in our session, made a presentation of his own 6-step change management model. But these others, I'm sure most of you as change agents have used or are familiar with. In fact, they reflect the basic steps that are also present in the Unlock UN model of change that is on the website. These 8-step processes consist of making a case for change, launching it, governance, vision, strategy, developing a strategy, getting quick wins, and a capacity to train the people and to sustain the change process. So the question is there evidence to substantiate these models? Well, actually, there's some pretty good news from the studies that have been done by Warner Burke, as well as by Stoughton, Rousseau, and de Kremer, and a number of other researchers who have reviewed the research literature. And they boil these popular change models to suggesting 10 steps or 10 issues to consider in your change models. Number 1, like the UN Unlock model, get the facts regarding the change. Urgency and calls for arms is actually produces negative outcomes. So present the facts, not the urgency. Second, assess the organization's readiness for change. That is to say, timing is everything when it comes to change, and to go with the flow is obviously much more easy to implement than is to go against the flow. 3, develop clear, compelling vision for change. But also the research emphasizes the downsides of change so that people understand and appreciate the risk involved. Communicate the vision using multiple channels, not just one channel. Multiple channels, you see, is critical so that people can hear the message from a number of different places, especially their colleagues. Encourage involvement and voice to gain commitment. That is critical because people would rather implement their own model than someone else's model of change. Social networks, shared experiences matter a great deal, far more than the practice models tend to overlook. Building these discussion groups, building these opportunities, brainstorming, and various other procedures that incorporate and get the opinions of the people so that, yes, indeed, it promotes experimentation, local adaptation, and short-term wins. Monitor the change process, resistance, and outcomes over time, because if you don't monitor the resistance, evidence shows they tend to fester and they grow into more significant problems as if you don't attend to them. Institutionalized change in routines, culture, management, succession, like most of the popular change models suggest. And yes, indeed, like almost all of the change models suggest, competent and trusted change leadership and change agents is crucial. This becomes a rather, I think, an insightful way of thinking about these are the items that I should incorporate in any change process in which I'm involved. Third, well, we do recognize that almost every change process entails resistance. And so the question is, how do you manage resistance to change? And it started off traditionally by thinking of change agents who labeled the people who are resisting the change change resistors, and who would, hopefully through training and indoctrination and selling, could get people to come on board with the change process. But then with top managers often saying, but if you don't get on board, we'll leave you at the station and the train is leaving. And that's rather a point of view. If that's still the point of view that's being held, maybe we should change our point of view. Don't assume that resistance is bad. It is oftentimes expressed by people who correctly and identify important changes that are needed in order for the process to unfold more predictably or more correctly. Second, communicate, educate, and reward the change effort. Yes, indeed, we need to do that, but to listen, to identify, and to correct problems in the change effort. That's the purpose for listening to the change efforts. And then if that doesn't work, engaging in a social political change movement, especially in large, complex, pluralistic systems that we are working with, where we begin to identify the forces for and against change, as Kurt Lewin would say, mobilize actors in framing processes, negotiate conflict and debate along acceptable rules, and want both, for the purpose is to search for both and or either and solutions to contradictions and tensions rather than either or. And supportive leadership, creating a sense of fairness and explaining the risks and social framing influence stakeholders' perceptions and responses to change. A very clear finding from many studies.
Andy, would this be a good time to take a few clarification questions?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I think Katrina has actually put down a couple in the chat. Katrina, would you like to go ahead and ask?
Yes, I could go ahead. So I was interested actually at one of the slides about change models. So is there any type of hybrid change? So a combination of these change types that we experience now. So in interorganizational collaboration in particular, so how is change and organizing for change is done. So do you see as a combination, kind of a golden middle between these four types? And also I'm interested in another question about the process models on a meso level. So particularly teams, how change can be brought by temporary teams working, for example, on digital platforms. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yes, indeed. These are four ideal type process models of change. But in every organization and in any change initiative that I have witnessed and studied over the years, you will find that all four of these models are occurring at some place. And indeed, if you start thinking about it, each one of these models has a limitation that is partially corrected by a different model. So, for example, in teleology, here you have some people that are dissatisfied with existing conditions. They search and screen, they come up with another solution that they try to implement. But that implementation may be something that is the antithesis to the status quo, which then in turn leads that group to engage in conflict in a synthesis. That synthesis may not only be the new thesis, it could be the variation that triggers new opportunities in environmental selection and retention through a competitive change process. And that selection process selects many out, which terminates the life cycle model. So you can begin to see how these models are interrelated. But the important point is, it now leads me and others to say, when you go and observe and monitor and indeed are the agent for a change process, you should be looking for at least 4 things in your head at all times. 1, on what issues are people in agreement? On what issues are people fighting? On what issues are they competing for scarce resources? And on what issues is there regulations imposed by outsiders or insiders? So that I have a multi-level 4 dimensions, 4 factors that I'm looking for, so that I don't get blindsided by the processes that are unfolding. Now, with regard to the change processes, I'm going to get at that issue on small groups and teams, if I may, as we go into further insights here.
Great, thanks.
Others? No?
No, at this point, that's it.
Great. So having said this and find some good news about these planned change processes, as well as ways for dealing with resistance, let's recognize that so far, what we've been talking about, and most of the field has been talking about, has been planned change models. They focused on this left column, episodic, infrequent, top-down models of planned change with the use of behavioral science and technologies, research, and theory. This is the basic model of planned change, where the change agent is the change maker, the prime mover who creates, directs the change goals, processes, and the outcomes. But the handbook authors are advancing processes of continuous, ongoing, unplanned, emergent change as an increasingly dominant form of change to be concerned with in organizations. Change in this view is a dynamic, unpredictable process rather than occurring in preconceived planned intervals or certain life stages. Organizations are evolving continuously, and many bottom-up changes may not be planned or produce the intended results. Here, the change agent is the meaning maker, a sense maker who reframes or helps people reframe how people think about the change model, such as, if the organization doesn't unfold the way you think it should, do you change your model to fit the organization? But also consider the significant demographic shifts and the technological shifts. And as you mentioned also, the technological infrastructure shifts, the alignment and the inversion that's going on in organizations, where organizational values should align with the employees' values rather than the other way around. And where we are seeing that it's impossible through social media and technology platforms to keep information quiet. These external and internal factors within organizations and groups trigger bottom-up sense-making and sense-giving, where there's employee emergent, directed, aligned change, and where pluralistic and divergent views and conflicting views are going to dominate, because there are not just one central top management strategic decision maker. There are multiple conflicting, partisan, distributed actors in the process, all of which leads to an important insight: dialectical, paradoxical change in social movements. These create contradictions, they create tensions, they create paradoxes. And so one of the critical issues with regard to change management insights is, especially in pluralistic, complex systems, is to begin to think about how might we manage paradox and contradictions. Depending upon how the individuals involved, do they view the contradictions as both and acceptable, or adversarial either or situations? And a power distribution among the parties involved. Are they stable and balanced, or are they unstable and unbalanced? If they are stable and balanced, then we can talk about the paradoxical management strategy that Wendy Smith and Lewis and others have been writing about extensively in the management literature. But when parties view the contradictions in an adversarial either-or perspective, the outcomes appear to lead to a dialectical conflict and synthesis, which is either an either-or confrontation of Hegelian thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. But there's two others as well. When we are in a condition when contradictions are viewed as both and, but among unequal powerful parties, then the outcomes tend to lead to assimilation, where the dominant parties incorporate but submerge the views of the less prominent parties. And finally, there is this adversarial either-or contradictions among equally powerful parties, and that leads to partisan mutual adjustment. It involves a range of negotiating tactics, including bargaining, partisan discussions, compensation, reciprocity, and even methods for preventing parties from being in touch with one another. This is Charles Lindblom's The Intelligence of Democracy, if you will. So these are, again, 4 alternative ways to expand our minds in thinking about how contradictions and tensions that are inevitable in bottom-up change processes will unfold. So as you can see, politics is no longer an option for many organizations. According to Jerry Davis, employees, customers, partners now scrutinize firms and their leaders for their political stances. In this context, social movement theory offers an appealing toolkit for understanding how change might unfold. Social movements entail a series of phased activities, choosing the right timing based on the opportunity structure, the framing the case in a way that fits the culture and the settings, of locating decision makers and allies who in turn are mobilizing in order to appropriate platforms for action. Social political processes have been with us for many, many years, as Donald Schoen discusses in his 1971 book on Beyond the Stable State. He observed in his studies that the way public policies typically emerge is as a result of, first of all, gaining good currency for an idea. And that good currency for an idea seems to unfold in this kind of a political process where in the initial, there is a threatening, disruptive event, which then in turn leads various kinds of solutions that were subsurface to become into the surface or to emerge. And these solutions around those various networks galvanize and give them a catchy slogan and push them into political debate. And Schoen emphasizes that policies, ideas, do not gain currency, do not gain good currency unless they win out in political debate and become legitimated. As they become legitimated, all the other ideas are falling off by the wayside and they become taken for granted as the basis for establishing policies and laws. And they only stay around for as long as the outmoded regime continues. Having said that, I'm ready for a discussion about the importance and the insights that social movements provide us for dealing with change that tends to be dialectical, conflict-ridden, pluralistic, not top-down, much more egalitarian, because it seems to me that this is the area in which UN SDGs have to be addressed. Comments? No?
I don't see any comments in the chat, but if somebody wants to jump in at this point.
Because this,
I mean, I had a comment of my own, if I may, since I don't see any in the chat.
please.
This is quite an extraordinary summary of so many different change models. Is there a meta model that you could offer which would help us think about matching these different ways of thinking about change to particular circumstances? Is that coming at some point, that you would have some kind of an overarching framework saying this is where this approach works best versus that?
Yes, I think we discussed that as the last chapter in the handbook. And Scott and I concluded that no, there is not going to be one singular model. And if there is a singular model, it's an assemblage model. That is to say, you have a repertoire of models, such as we started off with in this handbook, of 4 basic models that then blew into all of these other variations by leading scholars. And that what we need to do is to broaden our thinking and to become flexible, to have a rich repertoire that allows us to appreciate what model to use when. So instead of pushing and changing organizations to fit our model, what we have is a rich set of models, guidelines in our head, because these are exactly designs for undertaking processes of change, hopefully for the good. Yep. So that's where we come out on that one. But now we go on to, I'm sorry, was there somebody else?
This is Rich Burton. I was going to interrupt you, Andy, but go ahead.
Oh, hi, Rich. Nice to
Hi.
see you.
Good to see you.
Thank you.
Andy, this last slide you have here has these intriguing little, shall we say, down curves
Yes.
off of the big main curve, which I presume deals with failure and change. And I just wondered whether you could, most change effort, at least that's my casual experience, ends up in failure. And I just wondered how that fits into this whole discussion.
That's an excellent insight that we dropped off from this presentation. Darn. But I could say, yes, we did have some thoughts about that, which is right. Every change initiative entails many change endings. Things are dropping off. They get submerged. They no longer have their time of day. But the question is, given that these failures are typical parts of it, how do we deal with the endings, the failures of past activities or activities currently engaged with? And the insight that we said is a future direction for managing change is to begin to think about managing endings when all of us are talking about starting up stuff. And when we start talking about managing endings, we should be thinking about designing rites of passage, rituals that deal with the recognition of a withdrawal period, a liminal period, and then a resurgence period, much like society does for many of the significant life transitions we go through. Baptisms, if you will, in many Christian churches, or weddings and the process of betrothal and so forth, or the process of death and the funerals and the rites that we have established in order to help people deal with failure, with mourn, with endings, so that we can pass on to the next. That was the insight. So shall we go from here? Now,
Andy,
yes.
in the chat. Go ahead.
Who's
Andy?
there? Yes, please.
This is Mike Beer.
Oh, good, Mike. How are you?
Yeah, good. Let me propose something which I was kind of embedded in my presentation about a month ago.
Yep.
Can't we integrate the perspectives by thinking about change as a process of governance and learning over time? Okay, that basically is a collaborative process. It's not top and it's not bottom. It includes both. Whatever the top and bottom is in any institution, it involves them in some way. It enables a collaborative process in looking at the organization, at the system, whatever the system is. It could be a corporation, could be an institution of some kind. It could be it could even a nation. So, but I think in that, I think there are some common principles that integrate the 4 perspectives. Okay, that is, if you have a collaborative process, you also have a dialectic going on. Okay, the dialectic is not it's not an antithesis, it's a synthesis, okay? It's an attempt to arrive at a synthesis in a productive conversation of some kind. And that allows for disparate approaches to change to also surface. So I'm searching for that. I think that's what I've been trying to do inside corporations, where the problem is, of course, that most CEOs don't want a collaborative process, okay? They're not sufficiently, they embrace hierarchy implicitly or explicitly too much. And that's the problem. So I think the same thing is true anywhere in the world, and whatever the institution is. So that's my query here. Is there a way to synthesize around the notion of governance and learning, or learning and governance, as a core principle of all system change? Okay. Anyway, let me stop there.
Mike, you're right on target. You said it better than I could. I totally agree with your points. And it takes us into this notion of recognizing that the sustainability development goals are all located in public commons.
Mm-hmm.
And here, Mike, comes the distinction between, is it going to be handled by Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons,
Yeah,
who talked about system collapse,
exactly.
except for government fiat? Or are we going to consider, and there's many other approaches for dealing with this issue. Many have spoken about the tragedy of the commons, but I think, for me at least, the most insightful person has been Ellen Ostrom, whose sustainability through cooperation and collective action and self-organizing was central to her perspective. She moved away from the focus on power and dominated the 20th century political science, at least, and directed attention to institutions and how they affect the prospects of self-organized governance of common pool resources. She proposed sustainability through collective action and self-organizing cooperation among actors in a social ecological system, if the institutions are designed properly. Understanding this system, she talked about these complex sustainability social ecological systems, was part of her life's ambition. And this figure represents an attempt to summarize and to simplify, quite honestly, Ostrom's social ecological systems framework in terms of its four major systems of resource endowments, institutional governance, the user system, actors, as well as producer system, the people developing the programs or the businesses, and how they in turn affect one another. That was her overall SEC, or SES, I should say, sustainable, ecosystem perspective. Ostrom then developed a host of 57 additional variables that connect to each of these four major systems. And what I try to do is I have reduced them to 12, so that resource endowments include efforts at basic science and technology, and of course, natural resources, financing and insurance, and competent training and accreditation. Institutional governance incorporates legitimation issues, laws, regulations, and standards. User system takes more of the demand side, focusing on the cultural norms, market creation, and demand and competition. And the producer system, more of the proprietary businesses, of product development, business functions, and resource channels. And there are a growing number of studies that are being discussed by Jennifer Hooley and others in our handbook that talk about the uses of this framework for discussing many technological innovations and industry ecosystems. The studies show
just
that,
in terms of timing, you have about 5 minutes or so. There are a few more questions actually in chat, but maybe come back to them later. So maybe if you could wrap up in about 5. Thank you.
Thank you. Then I'm going to proceed ahead to say, if this is the complex social ecological system of Eleanor, you can begin to see how complex it is when you start thinking of the electrical vehicle transportation ecosystems. There's multiple systems interacting with one another in battery manufacturing, charging stations, electrical provision, as well as electricity manufacturing. So we begin to see the complexity of the activities, the cooperation, the coordination that's entailed, which leads to our insight that those who run in packs will be more successful than those that go it alone. Each UN SDG is a collective achievement, and no single actor can do it. Knowledge and power are distributed in different people and places, and the SDGs cost typically exceed the individual benefits. So we need to start thinking of ways like in a bicycle race, in a peloton, where the competitors are cooperating to break wind resistance for one another in order to get to the ending sprint quickly. I have also these principles for managing SDGs. In her socio-ecological systems framework, Eleanor Ostrom proposed a polycentric approach where key management decisions should be made as close to the scene of events and the actors involved as possible. To do that, she suggested these 8 principles, which certainly are issues that any UN SDG would have to deal with. And quickly, I want to emphasize too that many of these SDGs will create crisis and fear, such as Joanne Liu, former international president of Doctors Without Borders, experienced in the outbreak of Ebola in 2014. She pointed out, don't fear change, change your fear. In other words, again, change the way you think of things. Frightening news is often needed to gain attention. How else do you get other countries to begin to get involved in these issues, like Joanne Liu did in getting Barack Obama involved? And she suggested, however, 4 ways to do this constructively. First, get the facts, not opinions. Second, personalize the facts to create an emotion, an identity, a feeling of understanding. Third, propose reachable solutions. And fourth, create community by sharing the responsibilities. This won't be easy, but immediate global action can solve the Ebola crisis, she said in 2014. So in conclusion, I end up with leadership, and leadership matters a great deal. There are many different leadership roles that are entailed here to manage any SDG. These complex processes require multiple dimensions of leadership, far in excess of what one individual tends to have. You see, we're looking for competent leadership roles. The dimensions of leadership should match the dimensions of the task. But if they don't, unidimensional leadership of multidimensional tasks obviously results in myopic behavior and blindsided outcomes. Organizational capacity to change and innovate increase when pluralistic leadership roles are exercised. And so you might think about the complexity of the task here and the number of dimensions or roles of leadership that need to be exercised. And anything above this line suggests competent leadership. Anything below is going to be incompetent. So in conclusion, my 7 suggestions dealt with changing varieties of change models. Which one do you use when? Evidence for change, use evidence-based management principles. Resistance to change, it can both help and hinder change, but it does help to identify and listen to it. Bottom-up dialectical change, social movements is becoming the mode of change in complex organizations today. SDGs involve complex social ecological system change, as Eleanor Ostrom has suggested, in which running in packs is critical. And leadership, power, and influence, empowerment is the key. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy.
Questions?
We might come back to questions after the discussants, if that's okay. There are actually a few more in the chat. In the meantime, if you could take a look at those two, Andy, particularly around Sean's model. And there's an interesting question on black swan events and how do change management processes work for those. But Joel, if I could turn it over to you and your colleagues for a discussion of some of these ideas.
Great. So thank you very much, Andy, and thank you very much, Panis. So I think I'll ask Matt Svensson first, and then move on to Jens Flanding. I think we have about 5, 6, 7 minutes max for each, and then I think we'll turn on to questions. But if I could ask Matt and Jens to also just give a brief presentation of, where are you at the moment, and a little bit about your change management experience. So Matt, over to you, please.
Thank you, Joel, and thank you, Andy. Thank you, everybody. Yeah, very interesting, Andy. Really enjoyed the presentation, so thanks for that. I think it's a bit of a tour de force that you went through there with a lot of internal organizational change, and then sort of taking on the whole world with your your models for how to influence society. And of course, we are working in that nexus at the UN. I work at the Development Coordination Office of the UN, directly under the Deputy Secretary General, on a big change effort. It's called the Efficiency Agenda. We are been tasked to make the overall system more effective and efficient in terms of the operational services. We're doing this in order to make the UN more effective in terms of contributing to the SDGs, but we also been tasked with a cost avoidance, is the language being used, of $310 million a year. So we have work cut out for us, and they'd like that by end of next year. Thank you very much. So right now we're at about 100 million, I think, in terms of working towards this. And we're doing this simply by working with each country office in 131 countries. So this is just by way of context where I'm coming from. I've been working on change within the UN over the last 15 years, as Joel said. I think it's important to distinguish between the inner kind of organizational change efforts and the societal change. I'm very much on the inside of things, working on organizational effectiveness. But of course, we do this with a higher purpose in mind, the Sustainable Development Goals, and all our country presences are set up for that purpose. In the UN, we talk about theories of change when we look to the outside. How do we work with societies and governments to influence positive change? So they're kind of two different parts. I have a few questions back to you that maybe can spur on a few reactions. And I think one of them actually, Eric Law, I think it was in the chat, is talking about which questions to ask in terms of the scoping. My experience as a practitioner is that the world is not in 4 different categories of models, but a mix, and it's very much a timing issue. And often you have to be mindful of all of these things at the same time. I think you said that too. So in terms of assessment of the situation, there are models like ready, willing, able assessments. There are all sorts of situational assessments that the consulting companies use. But of course, you have to be mindful that these are just pictures of time. And things change, and you have to keep an eye on the dynamics. But I'd like you to kind of react and speak a little bit about what questions to ask in order to know where you are. How do you orient yourself in this world of different models? So that might be interesting to hear about. Then there was a point about going with the flow. I think, talking about urgency and the sort of the building urgency is sort of a classic Kotter comment, but I think that the parenthesis said, better to go with the flow, and I was laughing because I wish we had that opportunity. Most of the time when we have to achieve something, we can't just wait for the perfect situation to arise. We have to deal with the reality. Just to exemplify that in the context I'm in, where we are trying to create common back offices across the UN. Ideally, they should all be in the same building, these agencies. They're often, 10, 20 different UN agencies in the country, and they're often in different buildings. If they're in the same building, it's much easier for them to procure together, to recruit together, etc. But often they're not. We can't wait for that to happen. We're trying to make them move into a building, but of course that takes time. So we have to deal with that. So I just thought I'd comment on that. And then my last third comment would be on the speed of change, because speed is, the parameters and the expectations in terms of the speed, in my experience, is very important. Often, and this goes a little bit to the point before about going with the flow. If you have time, I'd like to do something a little bit of more exploratory, more iterative, more collaborative. So more of that kind of approach, maybe using behavioral science kind of insights. But sometimes you are forced into planned change, and you kind of have to deal with the duality of what the directive is and the reality. And most of the time, what we're up against is time. We can do this. We can reach $310 million savings a year. But can we do that in 18 months? I'm not so sure. Can we do it in 5 years? Most likely. So that factor, maybe you just, I'd like you to react to those three parts. So one was the kind of the assessment models, the kind of which questions to ask in terms of scoping the change and which models to use. The third one, just a comment on the flow, and the third, that was the second one. The third one was the speed of change. So that's all from me. Again, I welcome this, and thank you also to Joel and UNHCR for arranging. Over.
Thank you very much, Mats. I think we'll move on with Jens Flanding. Maybe the same model, Jens, if you please. Then a little bit of a presentation, and then some reactions, and then we go back to Panish and Andy. Thanks.
Sure.
Thanks.
No, thanks everybody, and thanks Andy for the presentation. Mats, I concur with many of your points. A magisterial piece of work, going through it, really impressed and very excited that these things are now accessible, I think, for a wider audience. My own background is in this context is having worked for 3 different UN agencies and 3 different continents, focusing mainly on result-based management, that then I think has been part of the SDG dialogue overall, but also on digital programs for both improved efficiency and effectiveness. I think trying for both, which makes things even harder. I've also had a background as a management consulting practitioner, sort of trying to really implement Cotter back in the day in the 1990s. This book was actually distributed to all consultants in Deloitte Consulting's global strategy and operations practice, which is an interesting idea as well, to distribute this book to more people, and I wish more people would have these insights. That's of course the first part. And I've also done research at the LSE, where I received my PhD around government reforms. So I think being able to connect some of these different elements, and it really strikes me that you bring forward Ostrom, is very, very interesting, because I think if you go and talk to the different departments at a university, they'll say, no, she's an anthropologist. No, she's an economist. No, she's actually a political scientist. And I think it really encircles a little bit also what you're trying to capture in the book, right? That we really are talking a lot of different disciplines that we're trying to apply. And I take here the practitioner view, right? And it's hard, but the perspective that I take, and that I think where your research is just very, very useful, is this sort of idea of purpose-driven innovation and thinking about what are the lessons within the managing change in the United Nations, where I feel that the Staff College has done a huge amount of work on that, and also documenting that, and very specifically on leading change in the digital area, you could say, towards the SDGs. And I really feel that they're an anchor for us to use in terms of why are we experiencing change, why are we trying to do change. And I would say that on the models, I like the questions that was asked earlier about, which one is it? I'd probably say to your Andy, it was a very good reply. I'd just probably say that some of them are becoming harder, and some of them are more relevant. And that's maybe a little bit of a different perspective. And I'd say the planned one is probably the one that is hardest to do now, but it's still the one that most executives, writ large, are trying to project. And I think you can almost sort of tell by the beginning of the consultancy to when the contract ends, there's a project-driven sort of chevron setup of where let's go through this. And that's I think is a challenge for change management overall to kind of overcome that, because that's also what people expect. What we're seeing in the UNHCR context, but also having gone through, I think, recognizing, 2020 was a very special year. We are kind of in a mood of constancy of change. And there is this idea that we're not really refreezing. And you didn't show Lewin's slide, but this idea that you can refreeze, I think, is now solidly been moved away. And I focus most on the digital dislocations, or the locations around digital. Matt's touched on them in terms of, what does it mean to be in the same office now that most of us work from home, or maybe we can't. We still need to stay and deliver in UNHCR. We need to be on the ground. We need to be in locations. We need to make sure that the humanitarian support is there. And so it's also not always a choice that we're able to make to kind of go along with the flow of these changes that are there. So I would say that if we talk about the models, the life cycle one is the one that I recognize the most, but it's not really regulated. There's not this ability to say, how is it going to flow? And I would say that in the area of technology, we're probably up in the Q2 quadrant that you described, and maybe that's a little detailed here for feedback, but I think there is this challenge or perception of assimilation from technology, that technology now or digital globally is driving too much. You see it in Europe with the concept of digital sovereignty. You see it in other areas. In the US is more a dialogue around the ethics of some of the way that technology is perceived or is actually driving change within organizations. And so the question I often get is, well, can we pause this change? Could we just take a step back to consider it? And I think your work here, your book, is really important in that context, that when we have pauses to stop, or we have pauses to change, and we should really review the literature and make sure that we have the knowledge and can bring it forward. But at the same time, the SDGs are calling for change, right? So we really don't have that option. Mm-hmm. We need to keep moving forward. And I think that sometimes the SDGs can be very challenging not to explain why we're doing change or why we're trying to affect change, be it efficiency or effectiveness, or be it supporting member states and trying to achieve the change around the SDG, which of course is the idea. It's not the UN being in charge of the SDGs. It's a partnership where member states at the end of the day are the ones that, and the results are accountable for that. But I think from a change management perspective in the organizational context, the UN leadership framework is also very important to consider. And I think that really broadens the options for participation in driving the change and making sure that those things can come forward. And so that's kind of where I would end. That I think, what are some of the things that we can draw out at the micro level, but at the same time, linking them up to the broader SDGs. We need to look a little bit at how can we reinforce the ability to lead change within our organizations, but not from the top, but more that everybody can become a leader in the right context. And I think drawing on the learnings of your book, that's kind of my main message. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Jens. Panish, Andy.
Thanks very much. Andy, would you like to take maybe about 5 minutes to respond to the discussions, and then I'd like to open it up to broader questions. There are quite a few that have gathered in chat, but we'll go back to them after you've responded to the UN discussions.
Yes, indeed. I will be happy to respond to some of the wonderful issues that Matt and Jens have raised. And they certainly broaden out our perspective on this. But the first one Matt raised was the questions to ask. Now, if we are change agents of this and engaged in the socio-ecological system, and no one of us, individual agencies or organizations, are in control, then the questions, and we recognize that all of these different systems and subsystems have to somehow come together in order to develop a significant solution. Then the questions are, which ones would you ask? Well, here I would begin by asking, where are the bottlenecks and where are the complements in this system that enable and prevent it from moving? Question one. Question two, Who is involved in which part of this ecosystem? Do we have the right actors in place? And sometimes not, of course. But that leads to question 3. What roles do or should we play, or I play, in this system? But assuredly, we'll have to run in packs. No one of us is firm. This system is not firm-centric. So learning how to manage politics, learning to participate in social movements, learning to manage conflict and contradictions in constructive ways, I think are the central future agenda for managing change processes. It's no longer, quite frankly, how do we do strategic plans in a systematic way? How do we obtain the relevant data in order to be rational in designing an overall system, as opposed to becoming part of it? That in turn, of course, takes us to going with the flow. If I'm in this peloton someplace, I better go with the flow. Otherwise, I will be run over. If I try to break out of this pack, I will entail all kinds of resistance that prevent me from even being able to compete to get to the finishing line. Going with the flow also means I have several alternative models in my head that I can use for different flows. The plan change model is wonderful when we can get consensus. But when we are confronted with conflict, how much better it is to use a dialectical model of debate and to achieve objectives. By the way, an awful lot of change in organizations, if not the vast majority, is motivated out of conflict and frustration with existing conditions that in turn then lead people to find a better way. But there's lots of people finding different ways. So conflict is helpful. Other times, recognizing this is a competitive world and resources are slim. So it's a process of variation, selection, and retention. Those are some of my issues or thoughts about going with the flow. Mads, you had a third question. I didn't quite get that. What was that?
It was, whilst flow is a timing issue, the last one was a speed issue. It was a bit about how much time do you have to make this happen? And I think, of course, it all depends on the context and in the reality in which this change is happening. I guess my reflection is that often we don't choose the timing and we don't choose the speed. So we have quite a lot of work to do. It'd be nice to insert yourself in the system and go with the flow. As somebody supporting a change process, that's not an option. That was my point.
That's correct. I would add too, with regard to that you pay me now or you pay me later. The change agents and agencies are often saying we don't have enough time. Things are going so fast, we can't keep up. And allow themselves to continue to be mired in this vicious cycle. When a way of breaking out of a vicious cycle is to create a virtuous cycle. A virtuous cycle focuses on addressing and involving people before rather than after the change, because the repairs that are needed to get and correct mistakes that have been made are far greater than the opportunity for spending a little time getting different people's involvements in that process. Yep.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. Obviously, we could discuss all day, but these are good reactions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Jens, you raised an interesting point about which one model would you use, and you tend to think of it more in terms of which one is harder to implement. And what strikes me is what makes some models harder to implement is you got the wrong model. The reason why your plan change model is not working, is harder, is because there's conflict. So why not switch to a good dialectical constructive process, which, by the way, emerges with many insightful, innovative solutions. It's also true that under conditions of high uncertainty, a dialectical process is far better for preventing hindsights and creating foresights. I see that Raghu Garud is on the panel or in the audience. Raghu, would you be willing to comment on that?
Got cold call, Raghu.
Is he there?
Yeah, he's there. He's there. I think he's trying to get his mic.
Oh, good. Because this is an issue of uncertainty. And under conditions of high uncertainty, we need to find, you don't want to invest all of the corporate treasury down one rat hole, right? You want to maintain options that provide you alternative ways of thinking. And that's precisely why we need multiple alternative conflicting models at play early in the game under conditions of uncertainty, because no one model is necessarily the right model. Raghu, are you there?
We don't hear you, Raghu. I'm not sure your mic is on. He might be having some technical issues. Maybe we can come back to him.
Okay.
Yeah, but okay. I do want to make sure we touch on some of the questions that we've accumulated in chat. There's a lot, Andy. I'll send you a complete transcript later.
I'll stop the sharing.
There are a couple of questions early on about things like, how do these change models cope with unexpected changes? So things essentially like the disruption we've all been living through over the last year. So black swan events. Do change models look different when they're dealing with completely unexpected events of this sort, or are they basically similar to the ones you showed?
Well, certainly, that's a wonderful question, because it does emphasize that increasingly so, change processes, well, organizations, and change is never ending, always ongoing, but it becomes more prominent in this period where emergent changes, unplanned, are occurring. Bottom-up processes, multiple processes, pluralistic processes, all of which suggest that we need to start thinking move away from this planned change model if we're going to address many of the change processes that are going on, and to begin to think about dialectics and dialogical processes of change that allow people and multiple parties to integrate, much like Mike Beer discussed before. It's not just bottom up, it's top down and bottom up and a lot of sideways. Why? Because there are multiple partisan distributed actors involved in these SDG processes. Does that address one of your questions?
Yeah, I think it's closely related to that. Thank you. Eric, I think, had a question earlier, but I suppose that was answered, Eric. Is that okay, Eric? Or would you like to elaborate on the question?
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Mats and Andy, for addressing the question. Appreciate that.
Thank you. Let's see. So Viviana had a comment on the Peloton metaphor. You want to expand on that, Viviana?
Yeah, I just really love the metaphor. And, you know, as a cyclist, we always want to be in the front group, but not all of us have the legs or the resources or capacity to follow the fastest group or to switch to the faster group because of the resource constraint. I think it's similar for the nations, for organizations. So Andy, I would really love to hear your thoughts on this. How do we and organizations escape the trap while they have recognized the need of switching to a different change model, but they are kind of trapped in the current change model? Thanks.
Very, very well said. Interesting question. One point about the peloton is studies that have examined if first movers win and gain their monopoly profits. And studies by David Teese and others show that the first mover seldom gains the lion's share of the profits. It's the second or the third movers. So running in packs is critical. That's point one. Point two is it's not the first mover, it's the first moving pack compared to the second to the third. So we as scientists want to be in the first pack, the first mover, when we should be focusing more on being a member of the first pack. Raghu, I see you're there. Did you want to raise a comment?
Yeah, it's working now. Go for it.
Good.
Yeah, my mic was muted. It's too early in the morning for me out here. Andy, fantastic job. I would recommend going with Usher's model to understand of cumulative synthesis to address your question, and several others in terms of the need for hybrid models. And what Usher does in his theory of cumulative synthesis, which has received less attention than Schumpeter's creative destruction, is that he crosses levels, he crosses disciplines, and he talks about some of the issues that you're talking about right now in terms of creating options for the future. So he has got time and temporality built into his model in terms of not only synchrony in running in packs, but also asynchrony. That is, different kinds of packs all over the place, I guess. But in most importantly, diachrony. That is over time. And so I'm going to just leave with this small comment. I think real options and options are about diachrony as much as about synchrony and asynchrony.
Thank you, Raghu. Yes, indeed. Looking over time. Further question. By the way, Raghu wrote this wonderful chapter in the handbook on Usher's partial cumulative synthesis theory, looking not only at the individual, but how collectives work together in a probabilistic way, which is another thing that we haven't talked about much. And that is that when we start thinking about the sequence of events by which changes unfold, a lot of it has to do with luck, probabilities. It is not a deterministic process, even though we would like to make it so in our heads. Another question.
So I'm going to turn it over to Lisa, who actually raised a question earlier also about Sean's model, but I think the conversation probably is now relevant to the question on grand challenges in building participatory architectures. So Lisa, would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
Thank you, Fanish. Thanks very much for a great session. So I'm wondering how we all relate to the recent literature on grand challenges, because it seems to me that a lot of the UN SDGs, they have this nature that it's not really clear who is the group in charge or who is involved, who has agency. There are no clear boundaries around any particular organizations or groups. And so perhaps the ideas that Ferraro and others have been putting forward about participatory architectures, cultivating multivocality, dispute orientation apply here. And I'm just thinking whether they feature in your thinking and in what way. I realize there are issues like politics and infrastructure and all those kinds of things that go beyond what was specified in the early paper. But I think it's potentially an interesting model and perhaps something worth building on in organizing for good, because it is a global issue. Thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah, that could be something, I guess, even Mads and Andy, would you want to respond or comment on that?
No, I think Matt, you perhaps have a better insight on this because this is very much a question of how do we put this in how do we address these grand challenges when they are such complex social ecological systems? And I would just only add, and the way economists have treated them is as externalities. The problem is when they are treated as externalities, they are no longer in control, no longer in your mind. They're out of mind, and as a result, you get blindsided.
Yeah, just
Go ahead,
picking
Mads.
up on that, Andy. I mean, one effort that's been going on for a while with mixed successes is not making an externality, but pricing carbon, for example. I mean, you have to create visibility in and around the implications of your actions and using fossil fuels, for example. If you have to buy the right to pollute, essentially, the pricing is embedded. So they are playing with that, but it obviously, as you also said, Lisa, mired with politics and interest, and I think the time factor is a big deal here as well. Technology comes in as a part of the solution, whether it's the kind of technology we're using now or other ways to create energy. So I don't know, Lisa, your question, I don't know if it speaks to the kind of the incentive structures and the organization of the whole effort. Obviously, the UN with the member states, the UN is not a separate thing, it's a body of member states. This is a big conversation around the SDGs and trying to frame these and also measure the SDG challenges in a way where we can report on the progress and all sorts of efforts are being made to kind of mobilize focus and interest and resources around the challenges. Not sure I responded directly to your question. It's a very big one, but that's my reaction. Over.
Thank you very much. I'd like to hear about agency, if I may just quickly continue. Like, how do we create agency? It may be with incentives, but it may also be with this type of participatory architectures that then allow us to engage in some experimentation. So just going beyond the sort of models where there is, clear boundaries as to who is in charge or who is supposed to execute or plan or resist or whatever. And I think a global world with these big challenges, we need to start thinking about models that are more open, that are more inclusive.
Oh, agree, yeah.
Certainly, as you pointed out there.
No, I think that many of the grassroots movements are probably more promising than the I mean, I shouldn't say this being part of the UN, but I think the UN is a very small player in the bigger scheme of things, and people really kind of sort of working on this the grassroots level and organizing around these things. I think that is where the change will come from. That's my personal view.
Jens, would you like to comment as well on this point?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, one thing I left out was, I think on your list of 10 items, Andy, I was kind of thinking, well, also in the spirit of having things being a little bit different. Maybe there's an 11th one there, or at least I didn't see. Maybe it's just a matter of unpacking one of the 10. But this idea of also measuring impact and really measuring, what happens if you're trying different models. And the reality is that we're probably fielding varieties of the different models in lots of different aspects of what we do. And some are more suited for other purposes, as your diagram well shows. But I think there is an element of measurement there that I think is more accessible also as we are getting better at using technologies and data, and we can turn that to our advantage. And I think it is easier then also to, to generate some of that evidence and bring it more to the fore. And then we may not then agree, and that goes back to you start with the facts, right? But can we generate better evidence? Can we have more empirical knowledge of what actually works rather than what we would like to potentially see. And so a lot of these elements that we're working towards are aspirational, and that's good. We need to have that as a why, but we could also look a little bit more at, what would actually work. And then that could also help facilitate a dialogue at a more operational level, I'd say, within organizations that, is very challenging, certainly within large bureaucracies that are also global and need to work across many different nationalities and many different constituencies and countries. And, it's very challenging once you go to the global level. So what works in that sense, I think, can maybe also bring some currency in, but we can only get to that if we measure the impacts of what we're trying to do. Thank you.
Thanks, Jens. Andy, I guess you have about 60 seconds if you want them to make a final closing statement. We're nearly out of time.
Thank you. The comments have been wonderful, and the opportunity to share with you these insights. I'm looking forward to further feedback. We are all in this process of trying to deal with this complex, buzzing, blooming, confusing world. And mental models, how we think about them, matters a lot. For what we think about the most, we usually tend to do. And so if we can broaden our understanding, our perspectives on processes of change, this takes me back, I guess, to the starting question. I think it was Rich who asked, how do you put these, is there a meta model of change? And to me, it seems to be assemblages, modules that interconnect at different times, that are operating at different levels and at different places simultaneously. And if we are alert and attentive to these generating mechanisms, we then have a rich set of ways to think about change, especially because we are dealing with people who think differently than us. Everyone thinks differently about the process, which means we need to vastly expand our repertoire of ways to communicate with others.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, panelists. This has been a great conversation. Our aim is not to close with complete answers to anything. This is the start of the conversation. Hopefully it migrates into other channels, other platforms. Our two volunteers, Lauren and Yashwant, will help curate materials. There's a follow-on to this program, which is on the 29th of April, where we're going to reverse the order, and we have our two experts from the UN go first and talk about their experiences on change. And Andy and Marshall hopefully can join us then, will serve as discussants on that occasion. So keep tuned for this conversation, hope to keep it going. Thanks everybody for participating, and that I hope was an adequately grand opening to a year-long campaign. Thank you. Thanks all for being here.
Thank you.
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 Thank you very much.